We're back, and we're joined for, I'm very pleased to say, a second installment. Our guest, Gordon Chang, the author of The Coming Collapse of China, a powerful contributor to, among other places, the Gatestone Institute and Newsweek, and of course, a man you must follow at Twitter. Gordon G. Chang is his handle there. Gordon, you were talking a little bit about evidence that the Chinese might be trying to do something to signal to the West, the United States in particular, that it's backing away from Russia, but maybe not so much as to really cause a problem for the Russians. Finish that thought, if you would.
Yeah, the Biden administration has sort of created a red line of sorts, saying that any supply of military equipment to Russia would trigger U.S. sanctions. Well, China has supplied anti-aircraft missiles to Serbia. Serbia is a close friend of Russia. I suspect that we are going to see that equipment on the Ukrainian battlefield in the hands of the Russians. So this is something that U.S. intelligence must absolutely follow. Also, we know from open source reporting from the very beginning of this conflict that China was supplying military intelligence to the Russians. The Ukrainians were using Chinese drones made by DJI, the Shenzhen-based company, and China was helping the Russians target the Ukrainian drone operators through information that is transmitted by those devices. So from the very beginning, Frank, the United States was turning a blind eye to China's supply of military intelligence to the Kremlin.
This point about DJI is really critical because there are a lot of American users of those Chinese drones, and it's been a very strong conviction of mine that that's hugely ill-advised, and this anecdote makes the point powerfully. Gordon, one other thing before we turn to two topics you've been addressing specifically in your recent writings. India. How is India doing in this post-invasion moment with Russia on the one hand, and is it a reliable partner in what we've come to call the Indo-Pacific strategy for dealing with the Chinese threat?
Well, India has been extremely disappointing in its reaction to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, failing to condemn it, buying Russian weapons and Russian hydrocarbons. This is just, I think, 2 points here. One of them is an outgrowth of traditional New Delhi, Moscow ties, but also our chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan delegitimized our friends in New Delhi. They empowered the pro-Russian element in the Indian security establishment. So this is a direct result of atrocious Biden policy. I'm not saying that we're at fault for what India is doing, but I'm saying that in that context, it is understandable. But nonetheless, India should not be supporting Russia. This is just beyond the pale of what the Russians have been doing. Of course, India is not a reliable partner on this.
Yeah. Any thoughts on the readout, as best we have it, of the Biden-Modi conversation?
I think that Biden understood that he was not going to move India, so it seemed like an unambitious position on the part of the White House. I understand that, given the context of it. There's very little the U.S. could do. So I think what Biden did was just try to continue the relationships with India, which was probably the right posture.
Very interesting. We'll be following that with you closely in the days ahead, because if India is out of the bus, that's a significant change in the sort of strategic forces arrayed against China at the moment, when we need it to be as strong as we can make it. Two quick topics, Gordon, with you. One is you wrote under a very provocative heading at the Gatestone Institute recently about China's takeover of not just the Solomon Islands, but the Pacific. Is that just an attention grabber, clickbait, as they say, or do you really think that's where we find ourselves now?
The Biden administration is in a panic over a draft security agreement between the Solomon Islands and China. And so is Australia and New Zealand. This is a result of American and Australian neglect of that part of the Pacific. So China will get a military base there. So unless we do something about it, and right now they have been on an emergency basis. The U.S. has been paying attention to the Solomons. Just a little while ago, we announced the reopening of our embassy there. We should have never closed it, and China is working very maliciously through dividing the Solomon Society, as it's doing in other places in the Pacific. By the way, they want an air base which is 1,900 miles south of Pearl in Kiribati. This is just a story all over the Pacific.
Yeah. An island hopping campaign is how I've described it, reminiscent really of what we did to liberate that part of the world in World War II. Much of it being waged by political warfare, of course, at this point, rather than military, but that's coming almost certainly. Gordon, let me switch to another topic that you've addressed recently at Newsweek, which is hugely important, and that is aid that the Biden administration is giving to what you've described as the plundering of American technology companies through changes to our patent laws or regulations. What's going on there? This is a topic that I don't know much about, but I feel very strongly is really important to our economic competitiveness as well as our national security.
This is a national security issue. In December, the Biden Justice Department Antitrust Division issued a draft policy on the enforcement of standard essential patents, SEPs as they're called. These are patents cover technology included in standards, and these are probably the most important patents that American companies hold. The Biden administration is trying to prevent American companies from having the remedy of injunctions to prevent infringers. They believe that our companies can rely on money damages only. Now, China is the number one consumer of the technology of SEPs. And if you only allow American companies to have money damages, we have to get a judgment in the U.S. court. Then we have to enforce that judgment in China. A Chinese court will never enforce a U.S. patent against a Chinese infringer, which means that essentially the most important U.S. technology will go to China for free. No American company will be able to enforce a standard essentials patent. And so basically, this is giving the most important U.S. technology to China. There's no words to describe this, Frank. This is the biggest giveaway of American tech, apart from allowing them to steal it. But this is just indefensible.
Unconscionable. Yeah, absolutely. Gordon, we have to leave it at that for the moment. I personally believe that the founders were right in making patents part of our constitutional rights, and it's just travesty what has been happening before the Biden team, but now at its hands as well. Thanks for calling them out on it. Thanks for the great work you do in so many of these outlets, and most especially for joining us. I hope we'll talk with you again next week. Next up, we'll speak with the great Benjamin Weingarten about matters domestic and foreign right after this. It's often said that elections have consequences. Rarely, though, has an election in one country had more profound consequences for another than the change from Donald Trump to Joe Biden has had on Israel. Before President Trump left office, the Jewish state had benefited greatly from his commitment to its sovereignty, security, and right to defend itself against Iran and allied terrorists. And Mr. Trump denied the Palestinians a veto over improved relations between Israelis and Arabs willing to make peace. Team Biden, by contrast, has repeatedly undermined Israel and those who share its determination to counter the threat they all face from an incipient nuclear-armed Iran. He has, moreover, Joe Biden, emboldened the mullahs with promises of perhaps another $150 billion. And he's renewed the Palestinians' conviction that they can wage jihad against the Jews with impunity. This won't end well.